Hello and welcome to the debate right here at Press TV. I'm Marcia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. When the stakes are high, then it is time to up your game. This is according to U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry regarding the Syrian situation. Though it may be just a game to Kerry and his allies, it is serious business for the Syrian people. After tens of thousands have been killed, along with infrastructure that has been destroyed, the Americans and their Qatari allies want to up the ante and send more money and arms to the insurgents, whom Russian President Vladimir Putin labeled as organ eaters.
Strategic gains on the ground in favor of the government of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad are frightening the life out of staunch Western and regional supporters of the insurgents who've been fighting the Syrian government forces. The battle for Qatari was a stepping stone in turning the tables in the fight. And now Assad's forces have opened a new front in the largest city, Aleppo. The insurgents' backers are at a loss. In Doha's meeting of the so-called Friends of Syria, the US and its major regional ally in supporting the militants, Qatar, pushed for a faster delivery of weapons to the insurgents.
We are going to step up in order to provide the capacity to the SMC and to the Syrian opposition to be able to directly address the situation on the ground.
The foreign ministers of the 11 countries that support further bloodshed have now agreed to secret urgent steps to help the insurgents. Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani also called for more ammunition for the insurgents, saying it's the only way out of the unrest. Earlier, Washington announced it would begin equipping the insurgents with arms and ammunition in addition to non-lethal aid. Talking of the changing the course in the ongoing war, the insurgents admit they've received weapons that will give them the edge in the 27-month conflict.
We in the Supreme Military Council, led by General Salim Idris, have received several consignments of weapons which we requested. They are the first consignment from one of the countries which support the Syrian people to reinforce our ability to protect the liberated civilian areas and accelerate the downfall of Bashar al-Assad.
Apart from the US official announcement, reports say the CIA and American special forces have been training the insurgents for months. The US and Qatar, among other states that are backing the insurgents' bid to bring Assad's government down, say further arms are needed in a bid to negotiate an end to the unrest that's supposed to lift the insurgents' morale so they could sit at the table during the proposed talks on Syria, dubbed as Geneva II. Others, however, aren't that positive.
Western countries claim that they support human rights, but when it comes to Syria, they give weapons to cannibals fighting there to enhance cannibalism.
Sending arms to insurgents only prolongs the violence in the country. The continued unrest will destroy Syria and its economy. It will destroy the whole region.
Also, the United Nations, as an international body regulating the events in the whole world, say it can't see a peaceful end to the daily bloodbath if arms continue to pour into Syria. This is not Ban Ki-moon's first rejection of militarization of the situation in Syria, but how much his words and the UN could influence the course of the events remains in serious doubt. The weapons are flowing into the wrong hands, either directly or indirectly. 27 months have passed, and the UN has failed to exert much, if any, influence.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of London, co-founder of the Syrian Youth in Britain, Danny Mackey, and out of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the U.S., director of the Middle East Forum, Daniel Pipes. Thank you both for being with us. Let's start it off in London with Mr. Mackey. Why is it that you think that the U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and his Qatari counterpart is now announcing that they are increasing their support for the insurgents? Do you think it's part of a psychological warfare technique as they have faced major defeats recently in Syria?
Well, definitely we could argue it's a case of psychological warfare. We could also point to the fact that there has been a changing situation on the ground where rebel forces have been losing territory which they have occupied for a period of time, and the rebels are essentially losing in the big battles occurring in Aleppo and Daraa and Damascus countryside, in which they stated they wanted to occupy Damascus, but 7 months on and nothing really has happened. So definitely the fact that they are losing militarily, and the supplies of ammunition, logistical supplies, and the fighters coming from regional countries have all dried up, which would essentially call for the regional allies of the Syrian extremists and insurgents, such as Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, who conspicuously work hand in hand with the United States to essentially embark on a strategy or a plan or a new narrative to arm the rebels through Turkey or through Jordan. The fact is that the United States of America have been arming the rebels indirectly through their regional proxies, who have been sending weapons bought from Croatia and Ukraine and other post-Soviet states, which are weapons which look like weapons which the Syrian government have, and are sending them to Syria through Turkey and through Jordan.
So what is different now, Mr. Mackey?
US military advisors
what is different now?
Jordan.
If they have been arming, the rebels, of course, perhaps not saying it as directly as they are now through various means and passages. So what is different this time around, or is there a difference now?
There is a very significant difference, which is the changing balance of powers on the ground. When we have a conventional army which is picking up momentum, and the rebel forces are lacking supplies, lacking ammunition, and unable to protect the very areas which they are located in, then this signifies a major problem and essentially a turning point. When the Western media states that there has been a turn in the tide, to quote the Washington Post, in Syria, how the government forces are using new strategies and new plans to defeat the armed rebels on the ground, then this essentially forces the hand of America and Qatar and Saudi Arabia to try new methods and new means to sustain the insurgency which has taken on for so long. This also comes in the same context of Britain wanting to arm the extremist rebels.
Okay, Daniel Pipes, what do you think Kerry means exactly when he says upping the ante?
I think what he means is that so far the American effort has proven to be fairly small, and for some Americans, particularly Mr. Kerry, frustratingly small. And so he's trying, by working with other governments and also by mobilizing support in the United States, to get a significant amount of arms to the Syrian rebels. It hasn't happened so far, and given the record, one can be skeptical that it's going to happen now.
Mr. Pipes, why would the United States want to get more arms to the insurgents that actually the Russian president has called them basically organ eaters? The Iranian foreign minister today called them cannibals, and we have seen some horrific scenes coming off the ground that was committed by these insurgents. Why would Washington want to get more arms in the hands of these people?
The Obama administration wants to support the rebels in order to have a stalemate so that neither side wins, and that the talks that have been scheduled to be hosted by Russia and the United States will lead to something useful. In other words, if the regime is winning, the talks won't lead to anything. If the rebels are winning, the talks won't lead to anything. But if there's a stalemate and neither side is winning, the hope is, the thinking is in Washington, that this will lead to useful negotiations. I don't think that's likely to happen. One cannot really calibrate this so closely, but that is the goal of the administration.
What about that, Mr. Mackey? What Mr. Pipes has said, basically, they're trying to get a balance in this, a stalemate, that perhaps both parties then would come to the table.
The fact that we could have a balance of powers on the ground militarily is completely inconceivable, as we have a guerrilla movement essentially funded by regional powers and whose mainstay, a backbone of fighters, comes from who are jihadists from other regional Arab countries. And we have a conventional army with conventional weapons which uses a technique of conventional warfare. The fact that the British or the Americans would state that they would want to arm the rebels in order to achieve parity in terms of negotiations is inconceivable and highly entirely irrational. The sheer fact that the Syrian government stated very clearly and vividly that they would send representatives to Geneva, and there was no need to arm the rebels as a prerequisite for negotiations with the opposition. The clear fact is that the political solution has been blocked by the Western countries. They can see that the rebels are losing on the ground. The fact is that America and Britain have unequivocally stated that there can be no peace negotiations whilst Assad is winning on the ground, essentially blocking a full comprehensive political settlement and wanting to arm the rebels. The fact that the rebel forces in Syria have only stated that they would negotiate if they were given arms is completely anti-negotiation, anti-political process and anti-political settlement. This is why Russia is essentially the only state advocating for a political solution, whereas the Americans and the British want to essentially arm cannibal-eating extremist so-called Syrian moderate rebels, the same moderate rebels who essentially eat the insides of captured soldiers, as Putin stated. So essentially we could not possibly argue why the West profess humanitarianism to this extent, yet want to arm the most extremist and radical jihadist rebels in Syria. Essentially, the Washington Post stated that the rebels, or the militants, the insurgents in Syria, receive more arms per day than the rebels in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union received per month. So weapons are reaching them on a day-to-day level. There have been reports of Stinger missiles being sent, of other anti-aircraft weapons being bought by from Croatia and other countries, which are essentially third parties, and then they are sent to rebels in Syria. The US advisors in Jordan. There are reports of Britain and France training rebel forces, opposition forces in Jordan. This is essentially directly aligning themselves with the affiliates of Al-Qaeda and Al-Nusra Fund, the same of which committed the Woolwich atrocity, the same ideology, but just in different countries.
Okay,
so it's
let me get Mr. Pipes back in on this.
Countries,
all right, Mr. Pipes, now the Qatari Prime Minister Sheikh Hamad bin Jassim Al Thani has said that arming the insurgents is the only way to achieving peace in Syria. What exactly does that mean to you?
It means to me that the Friends of Syria grouping sees the Assad regime as the problem. And, you know, Mr. Makki has given a lot of information, some of it accurate, some of it not. But he's certainly right that the rebels are cannibalistic and extremist and so forth. But one has to also point out that the regime, the Assad regime, is brutal, is attacking its own people with its military strength. So there are no saints on either side. This is a miserable civil war.
So let me just get this straight. So, but you're saying, though, Mr. Pipes, that Washington, though, would prefer cannibalistic, that you've just admitted that they are cannibals on that side, they would prefer supporting these type of terrorist entities that in some places they're actually fighting. Washington calls them the enemies. In other places, that they will send them more arms. They prefer to support this entity than actually engage in talks with the Syrian government to see exactly what can be done from the diplomatic perspective?
No, that's not what I'm saying. I'm agreeing that anyone who supports the rebels is supporting extremists who use awful tactics. I would also say that anyone who supports the Assad government is supporting extremists who use awful tactics. So there's not one side better than the other. They're both awful. What I am trying to say is that the Obama administration hopes, as well as Thani of Qatar, they're hoping that by arming the rebels there will be a parity, and then the two sides will go seriously to talks. It's a logic that I can understand, though I don't particularly support myself. I don't think that's going to happen. But that is the explanation for the Friends of Syria group of 11. It's not that they like al-Qaeda. It's not that they're supporting cannibalism. It's that they think that this is the way to have a stalemate leading to parity, leading to serious talks. That's the logic they have.
Mr. Pipes, doesn't it sound more like a case of doublespeak? War means peace. More arms actually leads to peace. What is the logic, really? I mean, if we look at it from a rational perspective, how can getting more arms anywhere bring in more peace? It's like the United States right now that's having a major issue with arms and asking for basically not to have any violence take place. Obviously, when you get weapons, more weapons into any area in the world, it's going to lead to more violence.